Imagine pouring your life savings into what you hope will be your forever home, only to find the whole deal threatening to collapse beneath your feet.
It's a nightmare scenario, really.
And that's the emotional core of the story we're unpacking today, a real estate clash right here in Hong Kong that escalated all the way to the highest courts.
At the heart of this deep dive is a very personal dispute between two sisters-in-law. We'll call them Miss Chung and Miss Lee, just to maintain their privacy.
Good idea.
Their disagreement over buying a property turned into this really complex legal battle. It's documented as Hong Kong High Court Civil Appeal Case number 49 of 1997.
Exactly. And our aim isn't just to, dissect the legal jargon. We want to really understand the fundamental issues here. What drove this conflict?
What were the crucial disagreements? What are the responsibilities, really, for buyers and sellers?
Right. And what can we all learn from this case? To maybe help navigate the often turbulent waters of property deals. We'll be diving straight into the court documents.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The initial understanding between Mrs. Chung and Ms. Z's, it was just verbal.
Just verbal. Made back in December 1991. Miss Chung agreed to buy a 3-story ding house. That's a specific type of village house in Sai Kung, Rongshuo Village.
Oh.
From Ms. Lee for HKD 500,000.
And quite a bit of money changed hands early on, didn't it?
A significant amount. Between December 91 and January 92, Ms. Chung paid Ms. Lee HKD 400,000 as a deposit.
Wow. 400K out of 500K, that's huge.
80%, yeah. And that's where the first major problem started brewing, the issue of the land premium.
The 4. Right. Mrs. Lee then asked for another HKD 700,000 from Miss Chung for this premium.
Which is, more than the house price itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here's where things get complicated. And you can imagine the alarm bells ringing for Miss Chung. Miss Gu just couldn't provide any solid paperwork for it.
Precisely. No official documentation. Ms. Chung had no way of knowing if this was, a legitimate government charge or where did 700,000 come from?
It highlights a crucial early lesson, doesn't it? Always demand proper documentation, especially with big money involved.
Absolutely. So, fast forward a bit. November 1992, the house itself is actually completed, certified.
Okay.
But that lack of a formal written contract became a serious hurdle for Ms. Chung. It stopped her from getting a mortgage for the rest of the purchase.
So a verbal deal, a massive deposit paid, but no proper contract to take to the bank. That's, a really precarious position.
Very. Eventually, though, in January 1993, they did sign a provisional sale and purchase agreement.
Finally. You'd think that would sort things out.
You would hope. But the disagreement over who should pay how much for the land premium, and crucially with what proof, it just kept going. And a critical deadline was approaching.
What deadline was that?
The deadline for paying the land premium itself was December 1993, because they couldn't resolve their dispute. Well, the developer of the property eventually stepped in.
The developer?
Yeah, Mingfei. They paid the land premium themselves, and in doing that, they basically wiped out Mrs. Lee's interest in the property altogether.
Oh, wow. So the whole deal just evaporated.
It completely fell apart, leaving Miss Chung's HKD 400,000 just hanging there.
Which, you can guess, led straight to court.
Let's talk about that initial trial.
Okay. The first judge actually ruled for Miss Chung, ordered Mrs. Lee to return the full HKD 400,000 deposit.
Plus interest.
Plus interest, yeah. Calculated at 8% per year, starting from January 1st, 1993, Mrs. Lee also had to pay HKD 5,000 in legal costs, and her own attempt to sue Miss Chung, her counterclaim, was dismissed.
So on paper, a win for Miss Chung.
It looked like it, but maybe a bit of a hollow victory from her perspective. While she was getting her deposit back plus some interest, she felt she'd lost out on more.
So she appealed.
She did. She appealed, asking for compensation for potential rent she missed out on. Damages equal to 10% of the property price, and she wanted the interest calculated differently.
How so? She wanted it calculated from way back when she first paid the money, in late 91 and early 92.
Okay, so she wanted more. And Miss Lee, having lost round 1.
Oh, she wasn't accepting it. She filed a cross appeal, basically asking the higher court to just throw out the original judgment entirely.
Meaning she wouldn't have to return the deposit at all.
Or pay any interest, yeah. So both sides went up to the Court of Appeal, each fighting for a very different result.
Right. So the appeal court has both these appeals. Where did they start?
Well, logically, they started with Miss Eli's cross appeal, because if that succeeded, it could potentially end the whole thing right there.
Makes sense. What was her main argument?
Her lawyer argued the first judge made some key mistakes. First, they said the judge wrongly assumed Mrs. Lai had to pay the land premium before asking for the rest of the money from Miss Chung.
Okay.
Second, they argued that providing the documents for the land premium shouldn't have been Miss Lee's job, especially since they claimed Miss Chung couldn't actually afford the premium anyway.
So Mrs. Lee's team was basically saying, it wasn't our fault. Ms. Chung couldn't pay regardless, and she should have known the premium was her problem. But what did that provisional agreement actually say?
Ah, good question. The provisional agreement did clearly state that the buyer, Miss the Chung, was responsible for paying the land premium.
So that helps Miss Lee's case.
On that specific point, yes. But then the court looked at another absolutely critical piece, the seller's obligation to provide a clear title to the property.
The proof of ownership, the right to sell, the basic paperwork you need.
Exactly. Even though the agreement said Miss Chung would eventually pay the premium, the court found that under both the agreement and standard property law, Miss Lee, the seller, had a fundamental duty.
Which was?
To provide clear, proper documents proving she had the legal right to sell that ding house. And crucially, this included the paperwork related to the land grant and that land premium.
And did she provide it?
The court found she failed to provide those essential documents, and that failure directly blocked Miss Chung from getting her mortgage.
The very money she needed to complete the purchase and pay the premium.
Precisely. So the court concluded, no, Miss Lee was the one in breach because she didn't provide the necessary title documents.
Okay, so even if the buyer pays the premium, the seller has to give them the paperwork needed to make it all happen. That seems fair. Now let's dig into what sounds like a really crucial point. The legality of the whole deal itself.
Yes, this was a major part of Ms. Lee's appeal.
Her lawyer argued that because the agreement happened before the government officially consented and the land premium was paid, the whole transaction was illegal, against public policy.
That was the argument. It hinged on the special rules for these ding houses, which are built on land granted to indigenous villagers under specific conditions.
Right.
The lawyer argued that selling or agreeing to sell before getting government consent and paying the premium undermined the whole policy, which is meant to protect the rights of male indigenous villagers.
So they were essentially saying this early agreement was an illegal shortcut and should be totally void.
Exactly. A pretty serious claim. If the whole contract was illegal from the get-go, it could potentially unravel everything.
A powerful argument indeed. How did the court tackle that? Did they agree it was illegal?
No, they didn't. The court firmly rejected it, looking back at previous cases, legal precedents.
Okay.
They reasoned that the agreement between Chung and Lee was, at its core, just a contract to sell property. It wasn't inherently illegal in itself.
But what about breaching the land grant terms?
The court acknowledged it might technically be a breach of the land grant terms, but they emphasized the government's typical response to that isn't to declare private contracts illegal. It's usually to repossess the land, which is a civil matter between the government and the grantee.
Okay. So breaking the specific land grant rules doesn't automatically make the private sales contract itself illegal under general contract law. That's a key distinction.
A very important one. Plus, the court heard evidence from a lawyer, Pan King Tai, who specialized in this. He testified that the government generally does approve these ding house transfers once the premium is paid.
So it's common practice then.
And, he added, the government hasn't really made a habit of repossessing properties in these situations historically. This suggested a sort of practical acceptance, or at least they weren't actively stopping deals pending the premium payment.
Interesting.
The court also stressed that the government's ding house policy is very specific for a particular group. It's not the same as some fundamental, broad principle of public policy that would automatically kill any contract touching upon it.
So not a core public policy issue that overrides private agreements, but a specific administrative or policy framework.
Exactly. The court even noted these sales could benefit the public by allowing non-villagers to live in these houses and, importantly, generating revenue for the government when the premium is eventually paid.
Right, rather than letting them sit empty.
And they also looked at the intention of Mrs. Chung and Mrs. Lee. The provisional agreement showed they clearly intended to complete the sale legally by getting government approval and paying the premium down the line.
So the court saw it more as a timing or procedural issue needing government sign-off eventually, rather than something fundamentally illegal from the start.
That sums it up well. So bottom line, the appeal court dismissed Ms. Lai's cross-appeal. They found no illegality that would let her off the hook for returning the deposit and interest.
Okay, so Miss Eli's attempt to keep the $400K failed. Now back to Ms. Chung's appeal. She wanted more money, rent, damages, and that earlier interest start date. Let's take the rent claim first. Why did she think she deserved rent?
Her argument was, look, because Miss Lai broke the agreement, I couldn't move into the house. Therefore, I suffered a loss equal to what I would have had to pay in rent somewhere else.
She was saying not having the house cost her money, essentially.
Yes, that it forced her to incur rental expenses she wouldn't have otherwise had.
Did the court buy that argument? Did she get compensated for lost rent?
No, she didn't. The court looked at the facts. Ms. Chung admitted she hadn't actually paid any extra rent. She stayed where she was already living. And she also admitted she hadn't planned to rent out the Ding house if she'd bought it. Plus, she didn't provide any solid proof of what the market rent for that specific house would even have been.
So no evidence of actual loss.
Right. The court basically said her loss was about not getting the property, not about having to pay extra rent because of Miss Lai's breach. So the rent claim was dismissed.
Okay, makes sense. No actual rent paid, no compensation for rent. What about her claim for damages, that 10% of the property price? HKD $50,000.
Yeah, she argued that since Mrs. Lai breached, she should get damages, and 10% seemed reasonable. She did acknowledge that the original idea of doubling the deposit as a penalty probably wouldn't fly legally.
But she still felt she deserved something substantial for the breach. What did the court say to the 10% idea?
They rejected that too. They agreed the double deposit clause was a penalty, unenforceable. Then they looked at the 10% claim. They said, yes, in normal deals, a 10% deposit is pretty standard, and forfeiting it might be okay if a buyer defaults.
But this wasn't normal.
Not at all. The amount Ms. Chung paid wasn't 10%. It was HKD $400,000, a whopping 80% of the price. That's clearly not a typical security deposit. It's a massive part payment.
Right.
And critically, the provisional agreement they signed didn't actually specify any amount for damages if someone breached, other than that unenforceable penalty clause. So the court wouldn't just pluck 10% out of the air. No damages awarded.
I see. With such a huge payment already made, it wasn't a standard deposit situation. You'd need clear terms agreed for what happens in a breach. Okay, last point from Ms. Chung. The interest calculation. She wanted it from way back in 91, 92.
Her logic was, well, Ms. Light had my money since then, so the interest should run from then.
But the court.
The court stuck to the principle that interest is meant to compensate for the loss you suffer because of the breach. So interest starts from the date the breach actually happened, not just from when you first handed over money.
And when did they decide the breach occurred?
They pegged it to early 1993. That was after the building was finished in late 92. And importantly, when the actual amount of the land premium became known.
Ah, so that's when Miss Lee's failure to provide the documents really became critical.
Exactly. That's when she demonstrably couldn't fulfill her side of the bargain regarding the title and enabling the mortgage. So the court upheld the original start date for interest, January 1st, 1993.
So in the end, neither appeal really changed the outcome much, did it? Mrs. Chung didn't get the extra compensation she wanted.
No rent, no damages, no earlier interest.
And Mrs. Lee definitely didn't succeed in overturning the order to return the deposit.
No, her cross appeal was dismissed too. The final result was basically upholding the initial trial judge's decision. Return the $400K plus interest from Jan 1st, 1993.
And the costs.
Ah, yes. The court ordered each side to bear their own legal costs for the appeal, except Miss Lee's costs were to be calculated under the legal aid rules, as she had legal aid representation.
So after all that, all the legal back and forth, what's the big takeaway here? What's the most important lesson for people listening?
I think this case just hammers home how absolutely critical it is to have clear, comprehensive, legally sound written contracts in any property deal. Verbal agreements, especially with large sums, are just asking for trouble.
Definitely.
And it really shines a light on the responsibilities of both sides. Sellers must provide clear title and all the necessary paperwork. Buyers need to understand what they're responsible for, like premiums, but they also have the right to get the documents needed to fulfill those responsibilities.
It also shows how complex things can get with unique rules, like the Ding House policy.
Absolutely. Those specific contexts add layers you need to address explicitly in the contract. Ambiguity is your enemy here.
So considering the huge emotional toll and the financial stakes we see in cases like this, what are the absolute must-have safeguards people should insist on? It's definitely something to think about.
It is. And if you find this stuff interesting, delving into property law, contract law, especially Hong Kong land regulations, there's a lot there.
The fallout from a broken deal can be just devastating, as we saw here.
Yeah.
Really understanding the legal landscape seems like your best defense against getting caught in those kinds of treacherous waters.